Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 304. Are you trying to reach that next level in your career? Have you asked yourself why you want to get to that next level? And what's most important to you in doing that? Take a second to think about it. If next level means next job level in your case, Duncan Epping would tell you that at some point, there is no next level. Duncan is a chief technologist, a published author, a blogger, and someone who loves learning. But he doesn't set goals based on endpoints like specific jobs or job levels. We're here this week to dig a little deeper on that topic and get some insight into Duncan's career progression over time to Chief Technologist. If you missed part 1 of our discussion with Duncan in episode 303, we talked about Duncan's first public speaking experience. That discussion was chocked with practical tips for giving presentations, but we also learned about Duncan's learning process, how he does that through writing, and how his writing process actually lends itself quite well to building presentations. This week in part 2 of our discussion with Duncan, you're going to hear about his career progression over time, his motivations, and some of the goals he set along the way. We'll talk about the qualities that a principal engineer or chief technologist possesses. And then Duncan's going to give us a little bit different perspective on the idea of being a generalist or being a specialist. Let's get you to part 2 of our discussion with Duncan Epping.
You've used the word story a couple times, in the context of talking about what you need to do in a presentation. I was wondering if we could roll back a little bit and talk about this story of your career progression to this principal and chief technologist title. It's definitely something that we've talked about to our audience before about not needing to go into management to advance your career, to stay in the individual contributor path, but just progress to higher and higher levels of what that is. And sometimes that means moving to a company that actually has that path beyond, you're an engineer or you're a senior engineer, and that's it. So being at an organization that has, a clearer definition of, maybe staff or senior staff and then principal and then, maybe distinguished or chief technologist, like whatever that progression goes. Do you have a strong point of view of what it takes to go along that path? I'm imagining that you do, having sat on those VMware certified design expert panels, and judging people as they're trying to get to these like higher levels. But, there's the technical version of that, and then there's just the pure career version of that. Do you have any strong opinions?
It's one of those topics which I always find difficult to talk about, because first of all, for every single company, it typically differs in terms of how you progress your career. What could be important for VMware may not be important at Broadcom at this stage, or the other way around. So that is always something that is very challenging. The reason I'm saying that is because I've had this question in the past a lot. How do you get to a particular point? How do you become a chief technologist at VMware? How do you become a chief technologist or a CTO at Broadcom? And it's an extremely difficult question to answer, because although I found myself in that situation, even if you repeat everything I did, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll end up in the same situation, because there's also something as being, at the right spot at the right time, right? You need to be positioned at a particular stage as well before you can actually reach that next level. one of the other things which I also think is interesting to mention is that even for myself, at some point, there's no career progression anymore. And you just mentioned it, the last level that may be within the company that you work for is senior engineer, or maybe it's principal consultant, or it could even be chief technologist. But then at some point in time, it stops. There's not always a next level, right? The same applies for the CEO of the company. There's no higher level for he or she. So that is also something to consider. Because you see a lot of people saying, "Oh, I want to get to that next level. I want to get to that next level," but at some point it may stop. So you always also need to ask yourself, why do you want to get to that next level? What is most important to you? One of the things that was extremely important to me when I started out in the virtualization space, it wasn't becoming a chief technologist or a CTO or anything like that. I didn't want to become a chief technologist or a CTO. The one thing that was really important to me was to learn as much as I possibly could about this new cool technology that appeared on the market. That is the one thing that I wanted to do. And that is what set me up for success. I wasn't constantly chasing new job roles. Those job roles were more or less chasing me, which I know sounds very funny, but that's the way things really went for myself. So when I started out blogging, 6 months or 9 months after I started blogging, VMware reached out and EMC reached out around the same time, probably within a time span of 2 weeks. They both reached out and asked me if I wanted to work for their company because I had written a lot of content. Now, I did not write the content because I wanted to land a new job. I wrote the content because I wanted to learn something about the technology that I had a passion for. And then when I ended up working for VMware as a consultant, I at some point in time got asked to move over to the cloud team. And the reason I got moved over to the cloud team, which was the team that initially deployed the very first VMware Cloud Director deployments at several large service providers, was because I was extremely passionate about new technology. I was always trying to figure out what that next thing was that was popping up within the company, and talking to people about that, talking with product managers, talking with engineers. So I got to expand my network through that. Then when this thing popped up, VCDX, I was like, okay, what is this VCDX thing? Oh, it's this next certification track that we have, and it's this next level thing. Okay, how do I get there? So I started to figure out how I got there. And through that VCDX experience, I ended up meeting even more people, which then put me in a position to apply for, or I didn't even apply for it, I got asked for it, into the position of technical marketing architect at that stage. So it was all a more or less natural evolution in terms of my passion and my interests, more than me chasing a particular job. And I think, especially when you look at a job role as in terms of something like principal or the chief technologist, that is probably one of those key factors. In my opinion, a principal or a chief technologist is not the person that has been working for the company for the longest time, right? You could be working for a company for 20 years and still be senior, and there could be another person who's been working there for 5 years and they're already a chief technologist or a principal that are a level higher than you are. And it's also not always the most technical person that gets to the next level. It's typically that person that knows how to communicate well, both internally and externally. But on top of that, is also extremely interested in learning new things. And that could be anything. I wanted to say learning new technology, but it isn't necessarily new technology. It could be anything. And I think being able to convey that passion and helping other people moving forward as well, that is what essentially then sets you up for a job role like something like a chief technologist, which is not purely about technology, but it's also about understanding people, understanding process, understanding customers, etc. It's much more than just the technology part. Because I've done these mentoring programs as well in the past, where I've been both a mentor and a mentee. And the one thing that always stands out when you have these mentoring conversations, the question that you will get a lot is, okay, how do I get from A to B? How do I replicate what you did and get there in a relatively short amount of time? And then when you go through the whole process, the answer is typically, well, yeah, I'm not sure if I have the time for that. I never thought about, time that I had or didn't have, because I was doing it, A, as part of my job role, but B, because I also enjoyed doing it. I love learning about new technology. I love reading about new technology. I love watching these YouTube videos. I love answering questions on the community forums or on Twitter or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, whatever it is, right? And all of that combined then results in hopefully someone seeing that you're that person within the organization that they could potentially use as a champion internally or a technologist externally as well. And I think it's all of those things combined.
So I'll just reflect that back to the role. It sounds like in your mind is the outcome, not the goal. The goal was staying curious, continuing to learn. As an outcome of that, you're reaching out to people, you're building your network so that you have a group of trusted people that you are discussing these new technologies with, understanding, making sure that you know, continuing to write about it. And the recognition and being asked to do these things is almost a byproduct of this curiosity that you're trying to live in, it sounds like.
Yeah, and it's actually one of the things that I discussed during one of the sessions that I did. That's probably maybe 2 years ago. I was talking about my career progression, and this is exactly one of the things that I brought up. A lot of people, when they talk about their career progression and they start thinking about goals, they tend to talk about that endpoint where they want to get. So they tend to set that goal as, I want to become a CTO of X, Y, and Z. But if you look at a company like VMware, for instance, when I started working for VMware, the role Chief Technologist did not even exist. There was a CTO, there was one CTO in the company, and that's it. There weren't 5 CTOs, there weren't 10 CTOs, there weren't 20 Chief Technologists. There was one CTO, and that was it. So for me, that was never a goal either. And my goal was never to get promoted. My goal was never to earn more money. Of course, that would be a nice side effect if that would happen, but it wasn't something that I was chasing or I was eager for to happen. My goal was always to learn more about the technology that I wanted to learn more about and help other people to understand the technology better. That was what I was working towards. And I think it's probably one of the biggest mistakes that people tend to make. They set these huge goals and then they don't reach it and they're extremely disappointed. I mean, the chances of you becoming a chief technologist or a CTO for a particular company are fairly slim. Even now within Broadcom, it's a huge company. The number of people that have a job title like that are still relatively small. So the chances of you getting it are also relatively small. In my opinion, you shouldn't set that as your goal because the chances that it leads to disappointment are quite significant. So I wouldn't set it as a goal. So yeah, I think the way you reflect it back, that is how I look at it as well.
I'm always concerned about confirmation bias. This is a personal thing, right? So my personal philosophy, Nick and I have talked about this, is the idea of like dreaming in bands, not like laser focused, as you said, like here's this one title, I have no idea what that person does day to day, but I certainly want that title. I want to do what in my imagination that person does, maybe the public facing version of what I think that person does. But this idea of like, well, here's what I want my environment to be like, the types of people that I want to work with, the types of projects that I want to do, the types of things that I want to learn, like that naturally leads to more opportunities and sometimes roles get created and titles get created and there's a brand new business unit that's getting created and, your name pops up as one of the people that like, well, this is a person who just always constantly seems to be learning and curious and has a good network and a great reputation within the company for being a force multiplier and a magnifier of things. So
it's funny because it almost sounds like you were explaining what happened to me over the past 10 years. Because literally, and I'm not exaggerating, when I became a chief technologist, there was no process for becoming a chief technologist. They actually created that process within VMware because they wanted to promote me to that level. That's what happened at that point in time. Before I actually got there, I ended up joining a team, which was a new team that was being formed, and I was asked to be part of that team because of the reputation I had within that part of the organization. So they knew my skill set. They knew I was passionate about something. They didn't really have a headcount for it, but they ended up creating a headcount and they ended up creating that role because they felt there was a need to have someone like myself to be part of that organization. So yeah, I think you were spot on. And like I said, in most cases, I was asked for the different roles that popped up. I was never really chasing them. They all happened organically. And I think that is something that a lot of people don't tend to understand. And that's what I've experienced during these conversations as well. When you talk to people during these mentoring conversations, like, oh yeah, it's easy for you to say because you're a chief technologist. Well, I didn't wake up on Monday morning and all of a sudden I was a chief technologist. I also started out as a consultant at VMware. I was just a consultant at VMware, and then I became a senior consultant. And then after a couple of years, I became a principal consultant. And then I went from consultancy into technical marketing. And then within technical marketing, I became a principal. And then I moved between the different teams because one of my managers actually started to create something else, and I got involved in that. And it all happens organically, and it isn't something that I planned for. It is just something that occurred over time.
So recreating that, I think it sounds fairly easy, right? Step one, create a time machine and go back 20 years for all the roles that, the information and things that you did leading up to that time before you joined VMware, right? So, obviously tongue in cheek, that's not easy. I mean, that's impossible. But the things that we can learn from that and apply to our own career progression is to emphasize that curiosity, that learning, the knowledge creation, the knowledge publishing, the building networks, learning who, you can reach out to without bugging them too much to build that relationship, the different groups, within your organization or outside of your organization that you can reach out to. It sounds to me like your experience is that when you build that reputation within an organization and outside an organization, the learning and the publishing of that knowledge is the important thing. Then the opportunities will tend to, over time, come to you. And you won't necessarily need to pursue them. Like, obviously, you constantly need to be working on those things in order to set yourself up. But over time, if you set yourself up as a center of mass, then things will start rolling towards yourself.
Yeah, for sure. But the other thing is, of course, you need to be open for opportunities as well. That's
Sure.
one of the other things. You need to be open, and you need to be able to spot the opportunities. You don't want to be afraid of, stepping into something which is unknown, which I've also done multiple times. I've been part of groups that would create a new product, which we didn't know if it was going to be successful or not. And some people don't take those opportunities because they may think, if it isn't successful, I may end up without a role. But in my opinion, if you've created a big enough network and you are, and not necessarily even the center of mass, because I'm not that kind of person that always want to shine and be the center of attention, but you do want to be that person that if someone wants to know something, that you think, what, I may be able to call Duncan and ask him if he knows where I can find the information. I don't always know the information, but I typically do know where to find the information. The funny thing is, because I was just saying I created a presentation where I was talking through my career, and that's one of those aspects that I mentioned as well. And one of the last slides that I have actually features a couple of people, and all of those people have the same common traits. And it's people like William Lamb, Frank Danneman, Cormac Hogan, Joe Bagley, you can name them, right? And they all do the same thing. And the funny thing is, especially with those folks, is I think the most important thing is none of those people is probably the most knowledgeable about a particular area in the world, right? Although, someone like Frank Danneman, he knows a lot about NUMA. There's someone going to be out there that knows 10 times more than he does. But that's not what people care about. What they do care about is that if they ask Frank a question, he's going to come back with the answer. Same applies to William Lamb. He knows a lot about automation. The important thing with William is if you ask him a question, and I've done it last week, I asked him a question, 5 minutes later, he comes back with the answer because he knows where to find the answer. And that applies to Joe Bagley, it applies to Alan Renouf, it applies to Cormac Hogan, etc. That's what is most important, that people can rely on you. And they know, hey, if I ask him or her a question, something is going to come back. And it may take 5 minutes, may take an hour, may take a day, but I know something is going to get back. And that is also where the power of that network comes into play. Because if you don't have a huge network, then you won't be able to find the answer. So those things I think are extremely important. And that's what sets you up for success.
100%. A lot of people have started off doing something that they really enjoy. You love to learn, you love to write, and it helps you learn. When that became a larger part of your job role, or when something you love to do becomes part of your job role, does it make you love it more, love it less, have to find a new passion, or do you find a way to keep loving it and doing it as part of your job without not enjoying it anymore?
Yeah, it's funny because if you look at the moment, blog writing or even book writing or anything like that, authoring anything, isn't really part of my responsibility. I could go, for 3 or 4 months without writing anything, and no one is going to ask me a single question. So for me, it's not really part of my job role at the moment. But of course, at technical marketing, it was part of my job role. And to be honest, I always enjoyed doing it. Of course, at some point in time, what may not be as interesting is to keep on writing about the same topic over and over and over again. I've written, I don't know how many articles about vSphere HA admission control, just to give a random example, or vSAN threat clustering, how the policy works. You're not going to write 25 times about that, because after the 5th time, you've written everything you can write, so it's going to get extremely boring. So the one thing I've always forced myself to do is try to figure out what I can write about something which hasn't been written before. So try to come up with something new. And that could even be for the same feature, for the exact same functionality, but just written differently based on a question that a customer had. Or it could be a completely different topic. That's why in my career, you've seen me moving from being a generalist in terms of virtualization, then focusing on the vSphere HA, then being responsible for availability and storage within technical marketing. After that, I became responsible for the SDDC. Then I moved to vSAN, or Evo Rail, as it was called back in the day, VX Rail. Then I became part of the vSAN team. Now I am also part of the VCF business unit, but focused on storage and availability in a broader sense. So I've always more or less, moved around, which made it a bit more interesting to write about things. But just to give an example, one of the things that I also do these days is I write about running. It's in Dutch, so it's probably not going to be very useful for most of the folks listening to this. I just enjoy writing in general. So for me, it can be about anything, and that's why it's interesting for me to write about new things. So that's why you may see me shifting topics regularly.
Yeah, I really like that. Making it interesting so that you keep the passion, keep the fire for it. One other thing you touched on in that response was this idea of being a generalist and a specialist. And I think there are a lot of listeners out there who have this fear of, okay, if I specialize, I'm going to pigeonhole myself. Or if I'm always a generalist, I don't have as many opportunities. Do you have thoughts on that decision point as to whether I should be a generalist or a specialist?
Yeah, I've never been too worried about that, to be honest. I mean, when I started out, like I said, I was quite broad. I started out as a system administrator, like probably a lot of the folks listening back in the 90s. And I've managed anything from novel NetWare to Windows NT, the very first versions that were released, Linux systems, Unix systems. I've done Lotus Domino mail solutions. And then I became a consultant and started to focus more on virtualization. And that still was pretty general, because you were doing the servers, you were doing the virtualization layer, you were doing the storage, etc. When I started working for VMware, I started to become more specific. But at the same time, the world also started, from a technology perspective, started growing, right? So you had all of these different types of systems that all of a sudden needed to hook in to the platform that you were responsible for. And I've never had an issue in terms of diving deep into something and being that go-to guy for vSphere HA, and then 6 months later saying, okay, there's this new thing that pops up. It's called Site Recovery Manager. I've never heard of it. What does it do? Okay, it's a DR orchestration platform. Okay, let's look at that. And then I'll become the specialist for that, or I'll become the specialist for vSAN. Or now that you're a chief technologist, you need to be capable to talk about storage and availability in general. But also, you may need to be able to do a deep dive session on vSAN threat clustering because the customer requires that. So, in my opinion, you don't necessarily pigeonhole yourself. If you have the capability to dive deep into something, while you were a generalist before, I'm pretty sure that after you've dove into something specific, you can go back up if needed. You're setting those boundaries yourself. No one else is doing that. So, but I can understand why people are worried, but I've seen people making the craziest shifts from left to right. If you look at someone like Cormac Hogan, for instance, he was a support engineer 20 years ago.
I had no idea.
Yeah, he worked for EMC as a support engineer. Then he started working for VMware as a support engineer. And I actually met up with Cormac for the very first time at VMworld, one of those events. And when I started working for technical marketing, we needed to hire someone for storage. And I recalled, hey, there was this guy working in Ireland that did these labs with me on site recovery manager. He was a really smart guy. So I ended up getting him into technical marketing. But he was purely responsible for storage. He was the storage guy for 20 years. And now he's doing data services manager. And before that, he was doing Kubernetes. So he's been going from left to right, up and down whenever someone asked. And the reason he's capable of doing that is not because, he's thinking about being a generalist or being a specialist. He just has a passion for technology. And if someone asks him tomorrow, hey, you need to focus on X, Y, Z, he's going to dive into that and try to figure out what it is and how it works and how he can help customers moving forward using a solution like that. And that solution could be, a tiny little feature that is part of this bigger platform, or it could be that whole platform itself. It's like I said, it's typically people are too worried about those types of things. If you understand the process of learning new technology, you can apply that to anything. And that's why I also mentioned, like I said, I write about running at the moment just for fun. And the first thing that I mentioned on my blog is that I'm not a coach. I'm not an influencer in any shape or form. Right? I'm not a specialist even. I've been running for 25 years and I've got experience in running. I'm just trying to learn more myself. And the way that I learn things is by writing things down. So that's why I'm sharing it. And hopefully it's useful to others. And if it's not, then at least I got to learn something. But if you apply that mindset, it doesn't really matter if you're pigeonholed into that particular section, that section of the world all of a sudden stops existing, because you can learn about some other type of technology next week or the week after. I think it's just that process that you need to focus on and not, that particular thing that you need to learn.
What an amazing mic drop moment, Duncan. That focus on curiosity and learning and writing to be part of a conversation and part of a community, build those connections. That's the kind of thing that can lead to a successful career. The title not being the goal, that process of curiosity and learning and building relationships being the goal, and the roles are almost something that will come to you if you've positioned yourself correctly. I thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, and your perspective. It's been just amazing to have this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Sure, no problem. And just a disclaimer: the role and those promotions may never come, right? It's not a guarantee. So I just want to add that, like I said, I've been writing about running as well, and I can write about it as much as I want to write about it, but I'm never going to run a 2:10 marathon. So that's not going to ever happen. And the same applies to something like this. Those roles may or may not come. There's no guarantee whatsoever. And that's why I think the focus should be here in terms of following your passion and having fun and enjoying it. Because if you're not enjoying it, it's for sure not going to happen.
Yeah, but we can always keep learning.
Exactly.
I love it. Duncan Epping, where can people find you if they want to follow up on this conversation?
Sure. I mean, I'm available on most of the social media platforms. So you can find me on X on Duncan YB. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Just search for Duncan Epping. There aren't too many out there. And then my blog is yellow-bricks.com. And like I said, feel free to reach out through a DM or through a message. I'm always happy to have a conversation about anything.
Really appreciate you taking the time, Duncan.
Thanks for having me.
I love the fact that Duncan sets goals based on learning. He's modeling something that all of us can do. And speaking of his goals, I did find a keynote discussion that Duncan did for the VMware user group called 6 Fundamentals for Advancing Your Career that you can go back and watch. In that presentation, he talks about setting an outcome goal and a process goal. So his outcome goal is not centered on any specific endpoint. Duncan said in our discussion that he wanted to learn as much as he could about virtualization technologies. That's something that we can keep doing over time. It doesn't have to end once we get a specific job. And then Duncan also sets process goals, measurable steps, quantifiable tasks that will move him closer to accomplishing the outcome goal. And that outcome goal is something that will set him up for more opportunities over time. I think that's the overarching idea here when we're setting our goals. I hope you listen closely to the discussion of that shifting scale of specialty. Duncan talked about his specialty shifting over time and the specialty of a number of his colleagues that had shifted over time. But this boils down to a willingness to go deep, technically deep in a new technology area, and being willing to change your focus. Are you okay with becoming the expert in something you're not an expert in now? Do you understand how you learn new material best, and are you willing to keep learning? And this, going deep, becoming the expert, it makes you focused on doing that so that hopefully you're not distracted by the winds of change in our industry. Because with all the technological enhancements we see in our industry, it is very easy to get distracted. Duncan talked about liking to have a change up, not wanting to write about the same thing all the time. So you can develop expertise in an area and move on to another one. It makes you very broad in technology. We also talked about some of the qualities of those principal engineers or chief technologists, people who have reached the highest levels of individual contributor in our industry. It is about being someone who's reliable. Even that person isn't going to have the answer to every question, but they can be relied upon to go and figure out the answer. Whether it's doing the research, asking the right person who knows where they can go and look. Are you someone who's developed a reputation of being reliable? I hope you are in both your personal and professional life. Duncan's story reminded me a lot of the story of Stephanie Wong and how she decided to follow the excitement and challenge, just as Duncan wanted to follow his interests and passion over time. If you want to hear those episodes with Stephanie, you can check out episodes 177 and 178. I hope you can take away the humility that we heard in this discussion. Duncan said that even if he writes something that no one will read or that no one likes, at least he got to learn something. So many of us need to adopt that mindset when we do new things, when we do hard things, when we go into job interviews or uncomfortable conversations, or when we're writing something or learning something new. So many different areas of life that can apply to. At least I'm going to get to learn something, even if this doesn't turn out the way I had hoped. It's hard to do, but it's a great attitude to keep at the forefront of your mind. If you are looking for more presentation tips, be sure and check out the Teach the Geek podcast hosted by Neil Thompson, who's a former guest of ours in episodes 193 and 194. His mission is trying to help STEM professionals become better public speakers. So he's got a lot of great resources that you can go and check out. So the number one tip for becoming a chief technologist, don't set a goal to become a chief technologist. Set a goal that you can continue working toward well beyond that. And know that the role you're meant for someday may not even exist yet.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at Network Nerd _ signing off.
Adios.